Hello, I'm Martin Thompson, and welcome to Ask the Expert from the ITAM Review. For our Ask the Expert sessions, we put a specialist in a particular field in the spotlight to share their expertise with ITAM Review readers. This month, I'm very pleased to welcome Thomas Trappler. Thomas is a Director of Software Licensing at the University of California in Los Angeles, and is also an instructor and advisor on contracting for cloud computing services. So Thomas has prepared an introduction for us to contracting in the cloud, and then he'll answer some questions from ITAM Review readers. And Thomas also has a special offer for ITAM Review readers that we'll share later on. So without further ado, welcome Thomas, good morning, and over to you.
Good morning, Martin. Thanks for inviting me here today. And good morning, everyone else, and thanks for joining us here today. I teach a 2-day seminar regarding cloud computing risk mitigation via contract negotiation and vendor management. And when Martin invited me to talk with you today, he asked if I could try and condense that down to around 45 minutes. So please forgive me if I talk a little bit fast today. I'll do my best to shrink it down. So let's dive right in. So as with the adoption of any IT solution, the adoption of a cloud computing solution comes with both benefits and risks. But the key question that I'd like to explore during our time here today is, how can we most effectively mitigate the risks associated with adopting a cloud computing solution so as to maximize the benefits? Transitioning to a cloud computing solution entails a paradigm shift. This may seem very simple, but it's essential to understanding how to effectively mitigate cloud risk. The paradigm shift is from a technically managed solution, where I build it, I maintain it. This is sort of the old or current way, something that most of us are more familiar with, to a contractually managed solution. Under this scenario, someone else is now doing this for me, this function, this feature, this process. How do I ensure that they're doing it right? This is a new paradigm for some of us. We're giving up some level of perceived control, at least, and so this is something that may understandably make us more nervous. So I want to focus on two key ways that we can mitigate the associated risks. One is through contract negotiation, essentially to establish the terms of the relationship between us, the customer, and the cloud vendor. Essentially, what do I get? Putting it in writing in terms of our understanding with that cloud vendor. And then the second one is vendor management, to maintain the relationship. Essentially, how do I ensure that I continue to get it? And to maintain that relationship throughout the product's useful life cycle. We'll touch on that a bit more later in the presentation. Ultimately, it's important to remember that if it's not in the contract, you can't expect to get it. You may have had conversations with a cloud vendor, you may have seen literature, you may have seen other documentation, but if it's not required in the contract, then you can't go back and hold the vendor to it. So most of the issues we'll be discussing here today don't have standard right or wrong answers. Sorry to say, but what I'd like to do is present today a highlight of a framework of issues to consider when you're investigating or adopting a cloud computing solution. Each of these issues should be individually evaluated based upon your organization's unique needs and tolerance for risk, and based upon the specific use case or project. In other words, the questions are the same to ask every time, but the answers may vary. So two key factors that will impact your response to each of these issues are data sensitivity. Ultimately, you want to know what type of data you're putting out in the cloud, and it will range from publicly accessible data all the way to the other end of the spectrum of highly sensitive data. Depending upon what type of data you put out in the cloud and where it lies in this spectrum, that will influence your answers to many of the questions that we'll present today. And the other factor that's going to influence your answers is business criticality. And this is essentially regarding whatever function or process you're putting out in the cloud, how business critical is it to you? Can you tolerate a day's worth of downtime and it wouldn't be a big problem? Or if the cloud process goes down for even a second, does your business come to a grinding halt? So again, you'll want to know where your project or functionality that you're putting out in the cloud lies within the spectrum in order to be able to answer the questions coming up. So while there are multiple variations of cloud computing, software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, the contract issues associated with each are similar and typically fall within one of these four categories that we'll be discussing today: infrastructure and security, service level agreements, data protection, access and location, and vendor relationship. So let's dive right into infrastructure and security. The virtual nature of cloud computing makes it easy to forget that the service is dependent upon a physical data center. In this respect, all cloud vendors are not created equally. The cloud is still a new and evolving market space comprised of both new and established vendors. So when we're contemplating putting our data, our business processes out in the cloud, how do we ensure that we're getting this? This picture is intended to represent a well-run, efficiently structured data center. In this case, it's actually a photograph of the Google data center in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And not this, right? An apparently not so well-run, not so efficiently structured data center that may take the term multi-tenancy to a whole new level. So first, it's important to identify the specific infrastructure and security practices that a vendor claims to have in place. So how do we go about doing this? The first step, simply put, is ask questions. Ask the vendor questions in advance, potentially via a infrastructure and security questionnaire. Now, you can build this questionnaire yourself, or I would recommend at least exploring the idea of leveraging some existing documents. Two really good documents that are out there are the Cloud Security Alliance. They have their Consensus Assessments Initiative questionnaire, and the Shared Assessments Group has their Standard Information Gathering questionnaire. Now, you can either use these as whole as they are, or customize them to meet your own unique needs. Either way, it's probably going to save you some time other than over starting from scratch. Areas to consider in this information gathering process include information security. Things like the sort of digital security things that the cloud vendor is doing. Do they have firewalls? What do they do with encryption? What level of encryption? Who holds the encryption keys? How do they handle multi-tenancy, data segregation, etc.? Another area to contemplate and look into is physical security. And this is more the old-fashioned type of security that can often get overlooked in this new high-tech world of the cloud. But do they have guards and gates? Do they have a security policy? Do they do background checks on their staff who may be handling your data? Things along those lines. And then the third area to contemplate under infrastructure security is operations management. Ultimately, how do you know that the cloud vendor is running a tight ship, right? What processes or procedures do they have in place for disaster recovery and business continuity, change management or patch management, virtual server provisioning, those type of things. So once you've identified the vendor's practices in these areas, you should determine which are important to your specific needs, again, on a case-by-case basis, and codify them in the contract, right? Get them in writing. The vendor says they're doing this is important to your business needs, you get it in writing in the contract. You can even look into the idea of leveraging the vendor's responses to your questionnaire, and if their responses meet your needs as is, you can incorporate the questionnaire into the contract as minimum standards. So leveraging the earlier questioning questionnaire process in developing your contract. So once you've got these things in the contract, how do you verify them? So one way is through third-party certifications. Now, currently, there is no one formal standard for cloud computing certifications. However, a number of options are available or developing, and I'm just going to go over them briefly here. Each one could take a significant amount of time on its own, but just a brief overview to give you some ideas. In the United States, the U.S. government has their Federal Information Processing Standard, FIPS 200, and the associated special publication document, SP 800-53. These are issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Now, the International Organization for Standardization has similar documentations, similar certification docs. They're ISO 27001 and the associated 27002. Both of these documents, cover similar territory, but they do have a slightly different focus. There's also the Statements on Standards for Attestation Engagements, SSAE 16, and the associated Service Organization Controls, SOC 2 and 3 documents. These are issued by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. They replaced what folks may have heard of in the past, SAS 70, back in June of 2011. SAS 70 had become a fairly widely adopted cloud certification standard, or at least it was labeled as such, even though it wasn't developed for that purpose, and it is actually an audit standard. So the AICPA, to their credit, recognized that SAS 70 was not being used for its intended purpose and developed the SSAE 16 instead. One other option that's a work in progress here, but the Cloud Security Alliance is developing their open certification framework. They've got, I believe, the first 2 phases done, but there's still work to be done for that process to be completed. Regardless of which certification process or audit process you may go with, to ensure your ongoing level of service and that there are no material changes to the vendor's infrastructure and security, you should essentially recertify, again under FIPS 200, ISO 27001, whatever it may be, at least annually. And I would also recommend after any reasonably suspected breach. So if there was some suspected breach of the cloud vendor's data center or other infrastructure within that annual cycle, it may be a good time to recertify, because clearly whatever was occurring the first, previously, perhaps wasn't sufficient to prevent that breach. Ultimately, the vendor should be obligated to provide all resulting reports to you within a particular time frame. Each of these certification standards go beyond just a stamp of approval. They result in a detailed report. You'll want to get a copy of that report, and ultimately you'll want to have staff resources on your end to thoroughly review that. But so you want to know that that report will be provided to you, contractually obligate that, and state within a specific time frame within completion, 30 days after completion, something like that. So again, you want to make sure to thoroughly review this to make sure there are no changes, or at least none that denigrate the minimum security standards. And should the results of any subsequent certification be unsatisfactory or indicate that the vendor is not meeting those minimum requirements in the contract, that the vendor should be obligated to correct immediately or as close there as possible, and if not cured, then this could be cause for breach of contract. So let's move on to service level agreements. As noted earlier, the most common variations of cloud computing service are software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, right? You'll note the key thing in common here is service, and that's why service level agreements are so essential when moving to or using a cloud computing solution. So much of the relationship between the client and a cloud vendor will be contractually governed, as we talked about. So it's important that the contract include service level agreements, SLAs, stating specific parameters and minimum levels for each element of the service provided, each essential element, right? So some examples of SLA parameters that you might want to bake in service level agreements for include availability, right? What's the uptime of the service? How, what's the allowable downtime, etc. Performance and response time, error correction time, and latency. Latency is essentially the time that it takes to enter a command and receive a response, since all cloud services are accessed over the internet and typically web-based. Each SLA should establish metrics for how it will be measured. You'll want your metrics to be as quantitative and unambiguous as possible. Describe data sources and data fields, collection times and frequency, responsibility for data collection, etc. Make them easy to measure and track performance against. It's also important that SLA metrics be crafted to be relevant to business outcomes, not to compliance with technical parameters. For example, if a cloud service is primarily used in support of your month-end processing, then measuring availability over the entire month won't accurately measure how your needs. If the performance is great all month long, except that last day of the month when you really need it, is measuring over the month reflecting that accurately, how it's meeting your needs? And I would say no. I would also recommend that you limit the quantity of different SLAs in the contract, primarily for manageability's sake. Anything more than 8 to 10 on the top end could really become unmanageable. You want to keep the cloud vendor focused on the service parameters that are most important to your needs, and you want to think long and hard about how much staff resource time that you want to spend on monitoring these SLAs. Each SLA you put in there will need to be monitored. So SLAs should be enforceable, right? To facilitate this, they should state specific remedies for when they are not met. Remedies typically fall within one of two categories. Corrections, codify the required actions the cloud vendor must take to prevent a future failure to meet the SLA. And penalties. These often take the form of a financial credit, but there's some form of penalty to motivate the vendor to meet the SLAs to begin with. But if you don't have remedies, then there's a diminished motivation on the cloud vendor's part to meet the SLAs. So if you do include financial penalties, and they tend to be the most commonly applied SLA remedy, it's important to codify when and how a financial penalty credit will be provided. Will it be provided immediately? They send you a check. Will it be provided as a credit against your next payment to them, which may be monthly or yearly, depending upon how you have it structured? You just want to make sure that that's meeting your needs. And if you've got a whole bunch of penalties lined up as credits against next year, if there are that many penalties lined up, you may be thinking twice about not renewing next year. So sometimes vendors will require a notification from the client in order to trigger the penalty. So you also want to make into the contract how a penalty would be triggered, who's responsible for that. Sometimes penalties are paid, we touched on this already a little bit, but sometimes penalties are paid during the current agreement cycle, and sometimes they're only available as credits against your next renewal or purchase. So again, you want to think about which one makes sense for your organization. It's important to note that the goal of including financial penalties, a lot of folks focus on this. I'm going to get really good financial penalties. The goal is not to get those credits, to get those payments back. The goal is to motivate the vendor to provide the required level of service. We all want the service we're buying. We're not going in there just to get these credits. Examples of some other ways of contractually motivating appropriate cloud vendor performance include, what other penalties or remedies could there be other than financial credits? How about reputational penalties? You can get creative on this, right? Vendor misses your SLAs, they have to take out a front page ad in the local newspaper or a prominent publication to publicly announce missed service levels. That can be a pretty strong motivational force. No vendor wants to go there. You could have the vendor disqualified from bidding on future contracts within your organization unless they meet all the SLAs. Depending upon how coordinated or centralized your organization is, that could be a strong motivational force as well. But if you're in a distributed organization, it can be a bit hard to enforce. Ultimately, your organization has to conduct its own assessment to determine the level and type of remedy sufficient to offset any potential damages that you may incur. So let's move on to data protection, access, and location. Since your organization's data will reside on the cloud vendor's infrastructure, it's important that the contract clearly affirm your ownership of that data. It may seem obvious, but when I originally started working in this area, it was not very common that a standard cloud vendor contract would even address this. The good news is that well-established cloud vendors are beginning to include this language. Somewhere along these lines in their standard contracts. The client's data is owned by the client. Now, again, it hasn't always been this way, so I look at this as a sign that cloud vendors are willing to listen to customers' needs as the cloud continues to evolve. I mentioned earlier, I'll probably say it a couple times, but the cloud is new and evolving. It's not only new for us, the customers, it's new for the vendors as well. If the customers speak up enough times with the same requests, I think cloud vendors can listen and will listen, if for no other reason than to distinguish themselves, among the competitive market space there. Oh, and yes, so I'm just saying, vendors are willing to listen sometimes. But taking this ownership of data just one step further, one thing you may want to think about that you don't always see in the standard cloud vendor agreement is an affirmation of your organization's ownership of the results of any processing of your data that occurs on the cloud vendor system. You put data in there, the cloud service involves processing of that data in some fashion that may result in new data. So you should own that new data as well. So to avoid vendor lock-in, it's important to plan in advance how you will switch to a different solution. So I know this sounds a bit like line up your divorce lawyer before you get married, but when you're adopting a cloud computing service, you are entering into this relationship with the cloud vendor. And there are multiple elements of the contract that will facilitate when the time comes to move on to a different service, whether it's to a different cloud service, whether it's bringing it back in-house, whatever it may be. You want to be prepared for that time in advance in the contract. So to help facilitate this transition to an alternative solution, the contract should state your rights to access your data. Right? It's important for the contract to identify the process by which your data will be returned to your organization, either at the end of the agreement or midstream if you need it. It should specify the time frame within which the vendor needs to provide access to your data. Very important, the format in which the data is to be provided should be stated in the contract. Data that's provided back to you in a proprietary or otherwise inaccessible format would be of little or no use when moving on to an alternative solution. And when that time comes and you are done using this cloud vendor service and ready to move on to some alternative, in the cloud, your data is out there and it may be located on various data centers within the cloud vendor's infrastructure. So you want to codify the cloud vendor's obligations to destroy your data after termination of the contract, including your right to audit that this has been done appropriately. The contract should cover the cloud vendor's obligations in the event that your organization's data is accessed inappropriately, right? What if there's a data breach? Now, the repercussions of a data breach will vary depending upon what type of data was accessed. So again, it's essential to know in advance what type of data you'll be storing in the cloud and where it lies on that spectrum we showed earlier, from public, non-sensitive data to highly sensitive, regulated, keys to the kingdom type data. Knowing this information will inform your decisions about the importance of clauses related to data breach. For example, at least in the U.S., healthcare information and credit card data will have very different issues than non-sensitive data that might be already on your public website. So key data breach issues to address include the vendor's obligations to provide notification about the occurrence of any breach. Right? You want to know if your data has been breached, including the time frame within which the notice must be provided to you. What should that notification include in the way of details? Right? What happened? What data was accessed? If they know already, who accessed it? Corrective actions that the vendor will take so that this doesn't happen again. And these actually take two forms. What is the cloud vendor obligated to do to stem the immediate flow of this particular breach? And what actions will they need to take to ensure that it doesn't happen again? And last but not least, indemnification. Right? This is important due to the high financial and reputational costs resulting from a data breach. Ultimately, who will be responsible for those costs related to this breach? I would argue that if the breach is the result of the errors or omissions of the cloud vendor, then they should be at least in part responsible for indemnifying you for those costs. So with a cloud computing solution, your data may be stored in or processed by data centers in multiple locations around the world. A variety of legal issues can arise when an organization's data resides in a cloud vendor's data center in another country. Different countries, and in some cases even different states, have different laws pertaining to data. So one of the key questions with cloud computing is, which law applies to my organization's data? The law where I'm located or the law where my data is located? There's been no absolute answer to this question yet. So for these reasons, it can be important for your contract with the cloud vendor to identify the geographic region or regions within which the data centers hosting your data may be located. And you also would like the vendor to at least be obligated to notify you regarding any changes to those locations. The contract should specify the cloud vendor's obligations to your organization should any of your data become the subject of a subpoena or other legal or governmental request for access. Ideally, you'd like the cloud vendor to be responsible for notifying you as soon as they receive any such requests and before they provide access to any of your organization's data. You would also like them to be responsible in the contract for cooperating at a reasonable level with your efforts to appropriately manage the release of such data. Ultimately, your attorneys may want to contest this request, and you want to have an opportunity to do so before the data is handed over. So let's move on now to vendor relationship. While some of the issues covered in this section are not unique to cloud computing, they are essential to its effective adoption. So a couple of kind of key reminders, right? May be obvious, but very important in the cloud scenario. An organization's leverage is typically strongest before they sign the initial contract or make the initial payment. And the cost to change to a different solution will typically be the largest cost associated with the use of a cloud computing service. For these reasons, it's important to codify in advance the terms under which your organization can continue to use the service, as well as those under which the service can be terminated or changed. So an example of the terms that facilitate your ability to continue using the service the cost to continue using, right? Vendors typically attempt to get an organization to focus on the initial buy-in costs. To protect your future interests, it's essential to ensure that the contract also specify your cost to continue using the service after the initial purchase period and volume. You want to get this in writing in advance before you sign up, right? The contract should include renewal price caps. I argue to be the lesser of the following: a particular consumer price index, and there is more than one, so you want to research that and be specific. A set percentage, 3%, 5%, or this one's easier said than done, but start out with this. What other customers of that cloud vendor pay, and negotiate to have these prices effective for as long a period going forward as possible. Certainly, push to get something up to 5 years. Anything more than that, is great, but technology seems to change at such a rapid pace that after 5 years, there's probably a good chance that we'll be moving on to something else anyway. But knowing what it will cost you to continue using this service and having limits on that, keep that decision to continue using that service more within your control. If you don't have these price caps, if you don't know what it's going to cost next year up front, suddenly the cost doubles or triples. And now that you've moved over and embraced this solution and trained all your staff on it, if you don't have those price caps, that control is more on the vendor's side than in your own. So try to keep this decision of whether or not to change to another solution within your control by restricting the terms under which the vendor can discontinue your access to the service, right? Who has the right to terminate and why? I would attempt to, in the contract, restrict the vendor's termination rights to triggering events, such as client actions that pose a significant threat to the security or integrity of the vendor's infrastructure. If such a clause is included in there, be sure to include your reasonable opportunity to correct any such actions prior to termination. It should not be unilateral. What if this is not correct? That you are not, your clients, your users are not taking these actions. You want to have a chance to investigate and to fix it if they are. Additionally, any payments subject to a legitimate dispute should not be cause for the vendor to terminate service. If there's a payment dispute and you're right, but the vendor can terminate, whether you're right or wrong, that tips the scales in the balance of coming to a mutually agreeable conclusion there. So an organization should always conduct due diligence when considering using any cloud vendor, right? Due diligence includes researching the stability of a vendor's finances or leadership, conducting reference checks, searching for legal issues, etc. Right? Something that's giving you a solid foundation upon which to base your decision. But even with all that legwork, even with all that due diligence, none of us can predict the future. And the cloud is still an evolving market space made up of both new and well-established companies. The weaker among the newer companies might not have long-term viability, while the stronger ones might ultimately become targets for acquisition. So ultimately, you want to make sure that you've got a strong assignment clause in your contract. If the vendor gets bought out, you want to make sure that there are terms in the contract that state that the terms in the contract are binding on successors or assigns. So you've done all this hard work to negotiate this great contract with the cloud vendor that meets all your needs. You don't want it to start over again if the vendor gets bought. So it's not uncommon for one cloud vendor to use the services of a different cloud computing company to provide their service to you. For example, a software as a service vendor such as Dropbox could be running their service in the data center of a third-party infrastructure as a service vendor such as Amazon. That's actually a true case. So this can increase the complexity of a cloud computing contract, especially in determining which vendor is responsible for which action, which deliverable in the contract. To mitigate this risk, the contract should clearly obligate the vendor you're doing business with to identify any elements or functionality of the service they're providing that they've outsourced to others, and to whom. Right? That way you know going in that who you're doing business with. And ultimately, no matter who your cloud vendor outsources to, your vendor should remain directly responsible to you for all aspects of complying with the terms of their contract with you. Again, it may seem obvious, but it's good to state very clearly. So it's just an overview here, some of the highlights, but I think you get a sense that cloud computing is big because it has a broad set of implications, ranging from meeting your business needs to ensuring compliance with organizational policy and the law. Its scope typically extends beyond the responsibilities of any one existing position or role. When I do my full seminar, at the end of the 2 days, a lot of folks have this deer in the headlights look, thinking, how can I possibly alone tackle all these issues? And what I recommend to them is don't go it alone. To effectively address these issues, you should leverage existing resources and build partnerships among key stakeholders to build a team at your shop that's prepared to address these cloud computing issues. Some members of the team to contemplate including, I always put the business process owner first. And this is the person who has an end result to achieve. They might find this great cloud service and think, wow, now I don't have to be slowed down by going through IT, going through purchasing. I can just plop down a credit card, pop on this cloud service, get my job done. But that person is probably not thinking about all these risk issues that we've talked about today. They're just thinking about getting this job done. So you want to make sure to roll them into the team, right? Because that way you can protect your organization from these issues. Other folks to have involved, IT vendor management. If you have staff in this area, typically consider that the IT vendor management role is sort of responsible for shepherding the life cycle of this process, from investigation to contract negotiation to fulfillment and vendor management issues, all the way to end of life and finding a replacement solution. You want to have your procurement folks in there, and they can be a good checkpoint, since depending upon how you're structured, if payments all have to go through procurement, they can be a point that says, hey, wait, have we thought through all these risk issues? Have we negotiated appropriate contract terms? You want to have your IT technical folks in there. I would say especially your IT networking folks. If you're planning on moving a big function out to the cloud, it's all accessed via the internet. If your network folks aren't prepared and have set things up appropriately, it could bring your network to a grinding halt. All that new traffic, they won't be happy for you. They won't be happy with you then. Probably have some form of IT security or IT policy folks. Important to have those on board. Your legal counsel, your risk management folks, and it kind of goes by different names in different organizations, but your audit, compliance, governance folks. It's not the complete list, but some folks that should definitely be part of your cloud team, depending upon how your organization is structured. So working together, these key units can effectively manage the wide-ranging implications and risks associated with adopting a cloud computing solution, and help to develop guidelines and best practices so that you don't have to recreate the wheel every time you go out to a cloud solution. And essentially, develop these guidelines and best practices to guide your folks regarding the appropriate acquisition and use of cloud computing services. So, as I mentioned, usually at the end of an overview, I get the question, how can I learn more? For those who would like to learn more, I teach a 2-day seminar on this topic, Contracting for Cloud Computing Services. Our next session is coming up March 25th and 26th in Los Angeles, California. To register, you can go to my website, www.thomastrappler.com. And to thank everyone for listening today, I'd like to offer a special ITAM review discount just when you're going to register, just enter the coupon code ITAM to receive that discount. And my email is there just in case anyone would like to chat offline or has any questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Thomas, for that introduction. Whilst we're on this slide as well, you do your seminars in the US, don't you?
Historically, we've done sort of East Coast, West Coast, Midwest in the US.
So if there's anybody watching this seminar that'd like to see Thomas come over to Europe, please drop him a line, and if there's sufficient interest there, it would be great to organise something over in Europe. So you can see Thomas's email address there. So Thomas, we've got a few questions from ITAM review readers, and if it's okay, I'll just fire these across to you if I may.
Yes, that would be great. And just you mentioning, yeah, if there's demand and interest to do the seminar in Europe in person, then would welcome that opportunity.
Perfect. Okay. So the first question I have, and this is one I hear myself quite often too, is cloud computing the beginning of the end of software asset management? So is cloud the end of SAM?
Crystal ball question, but I would say no. I mean, in my opinion, cloud computing will be replacing traditional IT to a certain extent, but I don't believe it will ever be 100% replacement of traditional in-house run IT. So we'll still need software and software asset management. And I would also say for cloud scenarios such as infrastructure as a service, where you're basically just buying the raw compute power, it's sort of the raw data center power, and running your own software potentially on that cloud infrastructure, I think it's actually going to make SAM more necessary and more complicated. So good and maybe challenging, but software licensing in a cloud environment adds a whole new wrinkle to how to track your software licenses and use them appropriately.
Absolutely. Okay. And the next question I have is in the same vein, really. So how does software asset management adapt for the future in the cloud? What can software asset managers do to adapt themselves?
And my take when I first started doing this, I come from a software licensing background, and then started maybe 5 years back starting to hear about software as a service, and wanting to be up on the latest trends and software. I'm keeping an eye on that, and then software as a service evolves into a component of cloud computing. I see folks with a software background as having a lot in common with acquisition of cloud computing, in that you're in both cases you're acquiring something intangible. So my take is that those with SAM skills, expertise in software licensing and software management are well positioned to adapt to address the unique challenges and risks associated with acquisition and management of cloud computing services.
Perfect. The next question I have is a bit more detailed, so bear with me whilst I read this. This is a question I got via email. So it's the US Patriot Act means any data held by US companies can be seized or copied or investigated without the permission or knowledge of the data owner. If the hosted cloud provider is an American company or has a business presence in the USA, are there any provisions yet for protection of non-US owned data managed by US cloud providers, specifically for the Patriot Act? I think you touched on this during your presentation, but basically, if could you just cover what your thoughts on that one?
Sure. I mean, that's that idea of in the cloud, our data could be in different countries than where we are. I would say in terms of the Patriot Act, from a sort of a legal regulatory perspective, the answer is no. One solution one could contemplate, for example, if you're in an infrastructure as a service scenario, would be encrypting all your data and being the only holder of the keys. So that way, if someone has to turn over your data, it could be that it's not useful to them without the encryption keys. But I would also note, I know that the Patriot Act is often singled out as if it's the only law that enables a government to access data in the cloud. But the research I've seen actually indicates that many jurisdictions, including ones in Europe, Denmark, France, Germany, Ireland, Spain, vest some authority in their governments to require a cloud provider to disclose customer data. It's just through a variety of different laws. for national security and that sort of issues. So it's more than just U.S. versus not U.S.
So next question I have, and this is a data challenge that we've faced as asset managers, for on-site data between countries. But I'd be interested in your thoughts in terms of shifting data between countries. So next question I have from a reader is there legal clarity yet that data moved between countries, i.e., exported and imported, as a result of cloud options, is not subject to import-export laws?
Um, I'm not a guru on, like the U.S. has export laws like EAR and ITAR. I'm sure other countries have that as well. Um, to my knowledge, the answer is no. Is there legal clarity on this yet? It's that same question of the cloud is so new, and its ability to span geographic or governmental boundaries um, has far superseded the ability for laws to keep up with it and to understand how to address it.
Okay, thank you. And final question I have for you, um, just as we wrap up, is I appreciate that you're not your area of specialization is licensing and cloud risk mitigation, but from a finance point of view, do you have a view on the resistance to cloud-based services from the finance department?
It's interesting, and I imagine each organization may have different needs. Um, I've actually mostly heard the opposite, that the finance folks actually are attracted to cloud computing due to its ability to reduce capital investment and transform it into operational expense. Um, so cloud computing can lower the initial cost and reduce the time it takes to deploy new services, so thus aligns expense with actual use. Um, so many businesses, my understanding is, prefer OpEx over CapEx also because of tax considerations, but that could vary depending upon where you're at.
Perfect.
So two
Okay.
sides to that coin.
Well, I'm conscious of time here, so I want to wrap things up fairly soon. But thank you very much for your time, Thomas. And for those listening to the call, I'd recommend you go out and check Thomas's website at thomastrappler.com. He's got lots of great resources on there and writes regularly for Computer World. So thanks again, Thomas, and look forward to hearing from you soon.
Yeah, thanks very much, Martin, for inviting me here today, and thanks very much, everyone, for listening and all the good questions.